This is Mr. Maycumber, and we are going to go through the Civil War. This is going to be a cliff-noted version, meaning that we are going to go through some of the most important people and battles, but we're not going to go through everyone. There's obviously much more that you need to know about this war, and much more that you can know about this war. While we go through this, we're going to find some very interesting stories, and we're going to play a game called I Can't Believe It's History. So get out your pen, get out your pencil, get out your notes, and let's go through the game right now. Alright, the first thing we need to understand is that there are several names for the North and the South. When we talk about the North, we're talking about the Yankees, we're talking about the Union, we're talking about the Blue Bellies. And if you look there, you can see that their uniforms are blue, so that's why they're called the Blue Bellies. For the South, we're talking about the Confederacy, the Rebels, the Greys. I mean, there's other things that you can call both of these groups, but these are the most frequent names that you're going to hear. I'm usually going to refer to the North as either the North or the Union. I'm going to call the South usually the South or the Confederacy. So get used to those names and those nicknames as I go through this. Next thing that we should understand is the presidency. Okay, Abraham Lincoln was the president of the North during the Civil War. He was elected in 1860 and then was reelected in 1864. So he serves for the entire Civil War. Remember, presidents get 4-year terms and then have to be reelected. The other side is the Confederate president, and that is Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis actually served a 6-year term. He was the first and only president of the Confederacy, and under the Constitution of the Confederacy, presidents serve 1 6-year term. So these two are the only presidents that you need to know. Abraham Lincoln, the 16th president of the United States in the North, and Jefferson Davis, who is the first and only president of the Confederacy. Now, why are these two groups fighting? Well, when we start the war, the North declares that the reason why they are fighting this war is to preserve the Union and reunite the North and South. The South says that they are fighting for independence and states' rights. As you can see, neither side says they're fighting for slavery. Now, as we know, slavery was obviously a big issue and was highly connected to this war. But it's incorrect to say that this war was fought over slavery. And a big reason why is because if Abraham Lincoln came out and said, we are fighting this war to end slavery, there would have been a lot of people in the North that are not going to fight this war. Okay? The South, meanwhile, is just arguing that they want states' rights. They're saying that the Northern government is becoming far too strong, far too powerful. The federal government is way stronger than the Founding Fathers ever needed and ever wanted, and therefore they want more states' rights, meaning they want more decisions left to the states and not the federal government. So these are the two big reasons why each side is fighting when they start the war. Now, obviously, we have to talk about some generals here. You've already learned about some of these guys. Most of the military schools are found in the South, so a lot of the good military schools are found in the South. So therefore, the South actually had better generals. And one of the really good generals was the top general, and that's Robert E. Lee. So Robert E. Lee is on the left-hand side there. What's pretty interesting is that he was actually pretty kind to slaves and really didn't care much for the whole idea of how people treated slaves. However, he really did believe in the Southern way of life, so he fought for the South. On the other side, we look at Ulysses S. Grant. He's the top general for the Union. There was other generals that served for the Union that were very important, such as George McClellan. George McClellan serves before Ulysses S. Grant, and he actually ends up challenging Abraham Lincoln for the presidency in 1864. However, the name that we most associate with the North is Grant. And Grant later becomes president after the war. So the top generals, the most important generals you need to be aware of, in the South, you're looking at Robert E. Lee. In the North, you're looking at Ulysses S. Grant. Now, when Lincoln becomes president, he has a big dilemma. The big dilemma has to do with the fact that the South is taking all of the Union forts that are located in the southern part of the United States. Okay, what I mean by that is the Confederacy is taking over national Union forts that are in states like South Carolina or Florida or Georgia or Alabama or anything like that. They're taking over these forts. When Lincoln becomes president, there are only 4 Union forts that are still in the South. Okay, the most important of all these forts is Fort Sumter because it had some great weapons, it had some great fortifications, it had a good location being in South Carolina. So Lincoln has a really big dilemma. Does he give up all of these forts, including Fort Sumter, and look really weak? Does he try to fight a war and begin the war? Does he want to be the one that starts this whole thing by firing at the Confederates? Or does he kind of play it cool and just kind of let things flow as they do? All right. What he ends up doing is he kind of plays it cool for a little while until Robert Anderson, who is the Union general at Fort Sumter, he starts to say that I need supplies. I need supplies or I'm going to have to evacuate and leave this fort and give it to the Confederates. Okay. Lincoln says, I don't know what to do. Lincoln officially ends up saying, you know what, I'm going to send some supplies in there. He sends him in a warship, which is a pretty interesting thing. I mean, he wasn't going to fire with anything here, but, if you're going to send food and water and basic supplies like that in a warship, it's sending kind of a mixed signal. So the Confederates see that. The Confederates say, you know what, this is pretty crazy. Let's fire on him. Let's shoot on him. Let's show the Union who's boss there. So the Confederates fire, and the North, the Union says, you know what, we're not ready to fight this war. We surrender. You take over Fort Sumter. And even though that no one dies here, the Civil War has officially begun. Okay? So no one ends up dying at the Battle of Fort Sumter itself. Robert Anderson and the Union say, we quit, take the land, we've moved on, but this is officially the beginning of the war. What's really interesting, though, is that there actually is one death. As the Union soldiers are leaving Fort Sumter, they decide to engage in a 100-gun salute, saying, you know what, we're going to fire our guns, we're going to fire our cannons in honor of the Union, in honor to all the people that fought in this war. The salute was cut short at 50 when a cannon backfired and killed one person and injuring another. That's right, folks. The only person to die at the Battle of Fort Sumter died because his cannon misfired and exploded. Yeah, I can't believe it's history. It's true. After Fort Sumter, before Fort Sumter, you're looking at the Confederacy having 7 states. After Fort Sumter, when this war is officially begun, they add 4 more states and they get to 11. 11 is the most states the Confederacy has during the war. Okay? Another important term that we should be aware of is something called border states. Border states are given to the 5 states that remained with the Union despite having slaves. So these are states like Maryland, Delaware, Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, which was actually created during the war. It was created in 1863 when it broke away from Virginia. Those 5 states allowed slaves, but actually stayed a part of the Union and fought for the Union because they believed in uniting the country back together. And that's a big reason why Abe Lincoln doesn't come out and say that I want to have a war to end slavery, because he wants to keep these states a part of the Union and keep them fighting for the Union. The first real battle is something called the Battle of Bull Run. This happens in Virginia. It's also called the Battle of Manassas. Because that's what the South calls it, because it was in like the town of Manassas. What happens here is that the Union soldiers march down from Washington, D.C. They're super confident that they'll be able to march right into the capital of Richmond, Virginia, spank those Confederates, show them who's boss, and they'll go home and celebrate, and all will be well, everything will be good. Because they really believed that this war was going to be short. When this war first began, Abe Lincoln says, you know what, soldiers, if you give me 3 months of service, I will give you a victory. 3 months, it'll be over, it'll be done, no big deal. Now, this is such a big event that Congress members actually say, let's go watch this. So they get in their horse and buggies, they pack some sandwiches, they have a nice little picnic, and they decide that they're going to watch this war, just like it's a play or something like that. Okay? Now, here's the funny thing about these congressmen. At one point, Union soldiers are running away from the battle, and one of the congressmen picks up his gun and says, "You get back there and fight." Imagine that. Congress people that are making laws are now watching this battle, having sandwiches, having tea, and then when a bunch of cowards try to run away, they take a gun out and say, "You know what? Get back in there." Yep. I can't believe it's history. The Confederates end up winning at Bull Run, and the big reason why is because they have that determination. They're really determined that they want to win to show the Union who's boss, and no one shows that more than a guy named Thomas Stonewall Jackson. Thomas Jackson is a Confederate soldier who gets the name Stonewall because of the way that he just stands in the middle of the battlefield while everything is happening among him. There's chaos happening, there's guns shooting off, craziness happening, but he just stands there firm. And the way he would stand actually was like two fingers up in the air, demanding people to listen to him and showing them that he's a confident person and that the Confederates should be confident in this war. So they look at his as a symbol and say, let's do this, let's win this war. All right, the Confederate Army is able to push back the Union Army, send them back to Washington, D.C., send them packing. The Confederates end up winning here. They lose less soldiers as well. We're talking about 2,000 Confederate soldiers dying and 3,000 Union soldiers dying. And this becomes a huge moment for the Confederates because they realize that they have a chance of maybe doing something really good in this war. And for the Union side, they realize that this war is not going to be over in 3 months. Now, I mentioned Stonewall Jackson. Here's the weird thing about Stonewall Jackson. Okay, during the Battle of Bull Run, we talked about those two fingers in the air. One of his fingers got shot off during the battle. Bad luck. Worse luck later on when in the Battle of Chancellorsville, he actually had his arm shot off. And who shot off his arm? Yes, someone from his own side. So a Confederate soldier shot off Stonewall Jackson's arm. Now, during this time, there were so many people dying. The medicine wasn't very good. Amputation was a common thing. So he gets his arm amputated, and the doctors look at this and say, this is Stonewall Jackson's arm. This is an awesome arm. We can't just throw this in the pile like all the other body parts, because that's what they do. They just throw it in a giant pile. They had mass burials, terrible stuff. They say, we have to do something special here. So what do? They bury it. They bury the arm, they put a gravestone, and you know what? You can visit it. That's right. This is from TripAdvisor.com. People have visited this place, and they say, it is excellent. 10 people say it's amazing. The only person to be against it was probably Ulysses S. Grant. I don't know. Some ancient ancestor went to go visit that and gave it 1 star. Not very good. But most of the people, look at this. Worth a stop. This is good stuff. You can go visit the arm of Stonewall Jackson. I can't believe it's history. Next up, we're going to look at the Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest day in American history. We're talking about 23,000 people that died in one day. Madness happening here. Shooting and cannons and horses and just bloody, terrible bayonets and just terrible battles and terrible deaths. And you can see there that the Union end up losing more men than the Confederates do. However, the Union are able to say that they win the battle because the Confederates run away. They do not have enough supplies. They do not have enough of the ammo. They don't have enough food. They don't have enough to fight this battle. So they end up retreating. And since the Confederates retreat, the Union say, hey, we're the winners. We're the last one standing. And Lincoln ends up doing something that's very, very bold. He offers the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, before I talk about the Emancipation Proclamation, how does Antietam happen? Well, pretty interesting. Okay? Robert E. Lee decides that he is going to issue a surprise attack on the Union in Maryland. Now, the only problem with Robert E. Lee's plan is that he ends up wrapping it around a cigar. He's going to send this message to another one of his generals to tell him to meet him there. When he's smoking a cigar, he ends up throwing it away, thinking it's all rubbish. He's going to throw it on the ground, and George McClellan ends up with that note. Okay, and he says, wow, this is pretty interesting. Maybe I should counteract Lee and I should meet him there in Maryland, and we should have a fight. So this bloody day where 23,000 people died happened because a piece of garbage was picked up and looked at, and it gave away this Robert E. Lee's major plans. Okay? Never throw away your trash. Never throw away your plans. Okay? Destroy things. If you have important information, destroy it properly. Get it together, Robert E. Lee. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation, which is a great phrase to say, fun thing to say, it freed all the slaves in the rebel states. Now, when I say that, it frees all of the slaves in the South, in the Confederacy. Okay? It does not officially free slaves in the border states or the Union states or anything like that. Only the rebellion states. Obviously, the most interesting thing about that, though, is that Abraham Lincoln is not the president of the Confederacy, so he really has no say as far as this goes. But still, he issues it, and it becomes very important because it creates a new purpose for the war. First of all, we are going to unite the Union. We are going to bring the North and South back together. And secondly, we are going to end slavery. At this point, it becomes very clear that this war is at least a little bit about slavery, and that slavery will eventually be gone in the United States. The Emancipation Proclamation is huge because it prevents European powers from entering the war on the southern side. Now, the European countries like England and France and people like that, they're not going to enter a war that's actually about slavery, and that's something that's so bad that they've gotten rid of it already. They're not going to help the South during this war. And that's really important because the South relied on the idea that they would eventually get help from the European powers. Looking at the Emancipation Proclamation, I just want to bring that phrase up again. All of the territories that were a part of the Union or owned by the Union were allowed to have slaves still. Okay? The mustard yellow disgusting colors that you see there, those are the ones that were no longer allowed to have slaves. Battles of Gettysburg, and I don't know why that's flickering like that. The Battle of Gettysburg is another important battle here. Lee led his men up into the North. He says, you know what, I think that if we can get one major victory in the North, maybe, just maybe, we can get victory here. We can show them that we're a strong army, and that we just want to end up tying the war more than anything else. We don't have to win the war. We just have to show them that we're strong enough to make them quit. So Lee says, we're going to invade the North. We're going to rush in there and we're going to fight them. The battle does not go very well for them, and the Confederates decide, you know what? Let's go all in. Let's make this moment happen. And they decide to go for something called Pickett's Charge. All forces ahead, all forces are fighting. Doesn't work. The Confederates lose, and this basically ends Lee's belief that a single big victory would end the war. Okay? This is basically the last hope for the Confederates. 4 months later, Lincoln issues something called the Gettysburg Address, which has now become a very famous speech. The speech, I'm sure you heard it before, goes, 7 years ago, our fathers have, it talks about all men are created equal. It talks about this whole idea about our forefathers putting these ideas in the Declaration of Independence, and that we should now follow them. Here's the weird thing about the speech, which we now think is awesome. It was only 10 sentences long, which is not a very long speech as far as presidents and famous speeches go. In fact, the guy that spoke after him, because President Lincoln wasn't even the headliner for this thing, the person that spoke after him gave an hour-long speech. Okay? And people, when they heard Lincoln speak, they're like, okay. And one person called it dishwatery. It was so bad it was dishwatery. All right? And if you look on the left-hand side, there's only one picture of Lincoln. If you see him in the middle, he's actually the only guy not wearing a big old hat like he normally is. That's the only picture of him from this terrible, quote-unquote terrible speech that has now become one of the most famous in history. So very weird that it was actually booed, not booed literally, but actually talked down to when it was first given. Yeah, I can't believe it's history. Sherman's March to the Sea. So when we talk about this war, we're talking about crazy destruction. So William Sherman decides, you know what? If we're going to have war, let's have total war. Let's do this, baby. So he decides to take his men and set out for a 1,000-mile march across the South. He marches from Atlanta all the way down and eventually gets to the Atlantic Ocean there. And all throughout the way, he is destroying things. As he's going through farmland, he's burning it. He's burning houses. He's killing civilians. He's killing livestock. He's burning bridges. Everything he sees, he's destroying because he says, we need to just show the South who's boss. We need to end this war. Who cares? Let's terrify everyone, scare them to a point that they quit. Sherman's March to the Sea, and you can see what it looks like here, is super controversial because some people say that it went way too far, that you should never hurt civilians, you should never scare civilians. That is not a part of war. However, some people say that this was totally necessary because it brought the end of the war quicker. The South was so scared of what might happen next that they said, let's stop fighting, let's end this thing, let's come back together with a union so we can try to move forward as a nation. Regardless of where you stand, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, it's important to recognize that the South actually ends up being pretty destroyed after the war because of this march to the sea. Because of all the farmland and all the destruction, this ends up being a huge problem that lasts for quite a while and has a very negative legacy. Very soon afterwards, we see the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. Basically, Lee ends up being surrounded. He abandons the capital. He's trying to run away. He realizes that he's losing the war. This is not going very well. Grant surrounds Lee in Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. That's actually the name of the town, Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. Lee just realized that it's over. He's surrounded. He's lost the capital of Richmond, Virginia. He's not doing very well. The war's over. Okay? So this ends up being the final stomping ground, the final battle of the war. Soon after that, the war ends, and Lincoln gets assassinated. And most of you guys have heard about this. Lincoln is watching a play with his wife when a Maryland actor, remember that's actually a border state, he's actually a Southern sympathizer. He's an actor who comes behind Abraham Lincoln and shoots him, and then he, jumps off the balcony, runs away, and Lincoln, they try to bring him across the street. They put him in a bed. He's bleeding. He's dying. There's nothing that could happen here, and he eventually dies. And what's a sad thing here is that Lincoln never sees the official end of the war. Because some troops had not officially surrendered yet. So he was never able to help figure out too much about that post-war United States and unification. Booth was followed. He runs into a tobacco barn in Virginia, and the barn is put on fire, and he dies, and everyone dies, and that's kind of the end of John Wilkes Booth, who's this terrible character in history. The final thing we want to mention here, one last person to say, is Wilmer McLean. And Wilmer McLean gets the title of the most interesting man in the war. Okay? Ready? I'm about to blow your mind, unless you've already read ahead. The first battle of which is the Battle of Bull Run, occurred in McLean's land. Okay? He had a big farmland. That's where the battle happened. He likes slavery. He likes this whole idea. Does not like the North very much, and says, you know what? I'm moving further south. I do not want to be this close to the North. I'm moving my family to safety. Several years later, he hears a knock on the door. Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant want to come inside and sign the surrender treaty for the war. That's right. The first and last battle of the Civil War happened on McLean's land. You know what I have to say about that? I can't believe it's history.